Hello, everyone. I'm Michael from the Marxist Education Project. This is our 7th meeting in this year's Socialist Register 2021 series of presentations. Tonight, we have joining us John Treat, who is engaged with the International Program for Labor, Climate, and Environment at CUNY's Murphy School. It's right there on the screen. John has described where he is. We will be looking at strategies for labor and developing low carbon mass public transit tonight. This is the Socialist Register series that we do every year, but we want to pay homage to Leo Panich, who worked with us to build these series. And I know that Leo was mentioned in the essay, and you and Sean Sweeney, who worked on this with you, we're close to Leo, and you do make mention of work you did with him 10 years ago, John. I'm turning the floor over to you, John, for your presentation, and thank you for the efforts you put in to get this show together for us. There you go. Thank you.
Okay, that's great. Thank you, Michael. I just want to check and make sure people can hear me.
Yes.
Yeah, good. Okay. Also, just to correct one thing that you said, I actually never met Leo in person. Sean knew him well and they were close. I exchanged emails with him a couple of times, but I didn't have the pleasure of meeting him, unfortunately. Still was very sad to see him pass last year. He was a significant influence on my thinking and sort of my coming to the left in midlife, I would say. So, and greetings, everyone. Thanks for showing up on such a beautiful evening, at least if you're in New York. I don't know where everyone is, but it's not a great moment to be inside at the moment in New York. I'm going to go through, I think, I haven't timed this. I think it's probably going to be about 20 minutes or so presentation, mostly slides, unfortunately, mostly words on slides. I didn't have time to do too much prettying up and pull some graphics and things. And it is based on the paper that Sean and I wrote. It is not, I'm not going to read the paper to you. It does cover the ideas and the arguments. Some of it's a little bit updated. Some of the data is updated. Some of the thinking is updated, but it's essentially, it's what I might write as the paper if I were to do it again today. And let me just, okay, so the slide has changed. You're seeing the second slide now? Good, okay, that wasn't working earlier. Just quickly, the paper that we wrote, we were asked to write this essentially because of a working paper that we had written about a year and a half earlier that you'll see on the screen here. We do a series of working papers for TUED, Trade Unions for Energy Democracy, and this was the 12th. Which took a deeper dive into the public transport question than what we ultimately did for Socialist Register. But just a provocative opening quote. This is actually from 2014, but even that early, you had the head of the UNFCCC recognizing that if you can't tackle transportation, you can't tackle climate change. So the stakes are high on this. Briefly, I won't read all of this, but TUED is a global network of trade unions and allies working essentially to defend and reclaim public energy. Currently 85 trade union bodies representing workers in 25 countries in construction, commercial services, transport, and several other areas. In terms of TUED's overall analysis and approach, a few things that we would tend to say generally, we think climate policy has to be consistent with the science. It's surprising how significant the implications of that turn out to be, including for things like challenges of 100% renewables and so forth. If you really want to take science and engineering seriously, the task before us is enormous, and we're just trying to get people's attention to that so that we're doing the right work. You'll see a lot of headlines about how the energy transition is happening. It's inevitable. It's all on the way. We think that's absolutely not true. What you're actually seeing, if you dig into the data, is an overall expansion of energy use, including fossil fuels. Essentially, all forms of energy are expanding alongside each other. It's not. There's no sense in which renewables are replacing fossil fuels at anything remotely like scale. The market-based approaches to climate policy, which is sort of sticks, we call it sticks and carrots, incentives and disincentives, has failed comprehensively. We document that in a number of the working papers. We did a working paper on just transition in particular, which is especially relevant to labor discussions, obviously. And the argument we make is that essentially the concept, although despite its radical origins with Tony Mazzocchi and the oil and chemical workers, it's been essentially instrumentalized for a political project of shoring up social democracy. We think that unions and their allies have to unite behind a public goods approach, reject the neoliberal framework comprehensively, and fight for reclaiming and extending public ownership of energy and public transport, which I'll cover here. So in the paper, we kind of talk, we start by talking about the actual present. This is a slightly updated version of that thinking, but I just run through these quickly. And then I'll spend some time on each of these. Transport emissions are continuing to rise. And in fact, transport emissions, now that the power sector has been reined in a little bit, transport emissions is the fastest rising sector. There are far too many cars on the road. These are creating all kinds of health and safety problems. Cities are urbanizing rapidly and public transport is not keeping up, especially in the global south. Companies like Uber and Lyft are coming in and filling the gap left by inadequate public transport, and that unfortunately is further undermining public transport. And mainstream climate policy, as I said, is failing, not only in general, but also specifically in relation to transport. And I will talk a bit in detail about that. A few points on each of those then. Transport emissions are rising. As I mentioned, it's the fastest growing sector. Transport accounts for nearly a quarter of all CO2 emissions and about 14% of total greenhouse gas emissions, if you include other gases. Projected to increase by 70% by 2050. Emissions from air travel and shipping are rising faster than road transport, but road transport still accounts for the overwhelming majority of transport emissions, and 2/3 of that is from the movement of people, just 1/3 from freight. That has shifted slightly under COVID, but there's no reason to think that there are significant structural changes that COVID has brought. Global freight volumes were expected to increase by nearly 70% over the next 15 years or another 10 years from 2015. That may change a little bit, but it's already a massive part of the picture. Trade-led growth obviously has been part of the whole neoliberal project, and that has fed into this emissions profile. And neoliberal climate policies actually stood in the way of public transport. This is just a graph to illustrate. If you see the middle red line there, it shows that transport has sort of steadily crept upward, a little dip in 2008-09. But as I mentioned, now that electricity and heat has been scaled back a little bit, transport's the fastest growing. These numbers are a few years old. It's hard to get updated graphs on a lot of this stuff. They don't necessarily want to make it easy to see how bad things are. But just to get a sense of how bad things can and will be without dramatic action, this is a projection out to 2100. And if you see the bottom blue line there shows, even with sort of the increased ambition that's been called for under Paris, you're still seeing a dramatic increase in emissions from transport over the next 80 years. As I mentioned, there are too many cars on the road. The expansion of urban populations has led to a massive rise in private vehicle ownership, including in the global south. Globally, there were nearly 100 billion cars and light commercial vehicles sold in 2018. I think it was a little higher last year. 4 times the number in 1965, just to get a sense of the scale of the phenomenon that we've seen over the last few decades. Again, before COVID, the number of vehicles on the road was projected to double by 2030 and triple by 2050. Those are staggering numbers. I think people don't realize the enormous amount of not just raw materials and energy going into the manufacture of those vehicles, but obviously also the emissions and everything else, the congestion that goes along with them. SUV sales, believe it or not, are growing especially rapidly. And I've got a graph here to show that. This is around the world. In every major market, SUVs are growing. They tend to be the preferred vehicle. They're growing, SUV sales are growing faster than sedan sales in many countries now. Cities are urbanizing, especially in the global south. Roughly 1/3 of the world's population now live in just about 2,000 metropolitan areas. That accounts for 60% of the world urban population. Nearly 1 billion people will become new city inhabitants in the next 15 years, and there will be well over 400 new cities by 2035. That's a recent statistic. And the reason that we mention that is to point out that even the most progressive governments would struggle massively to deal with these shifts, these demographic shifts and growth that we're seeing here. And that challenge becomes even more intimidating when you think about the fact that cities are also growing spatially, physically spreading out as they become more crowded. And public transport is not keeping up. Limited availability is a major factor driving the rise in private vehicle ownership. If you can't get to work on the bus, you're going to buy a car if you need that job. And because private cars often share infrastructure with public buses and trams and other surface modes, the congestion actually impedes the smooth running of public transport systems. So there's a vicious cycle that sets in. If public transport is inadequate or tends to run late, people are going to resort to cars. That's going to slow down public transport even further. So there's a very serious and dangerous dynamic in play. At the same time, just 10% of the world's population is responsible for 80% of motorized travel. Huge numbers of people around the world rarely use any form of motorized travel. They use bicycles or feet or something like that. And these cars have turned a lot of cities into death traps. I won't go through all of these statistics. I'm happy to share the slides afterward. I would draw your attention to the third bullet. For children under 10, road accidents are the largest single cause of death globally. And 50 million people are injured on roads every day, or every year. As I mentioned, private transport network companies like Uber and Lyft, ride-hailing companies, are filling the gap. Estimated that as many as 1/3 of the rides that people take on those services are due to poor or inadequate or infrequent public transport. And the impact that they've had on public transport systems has been negative across the board. It reduces ridership, which reduces fares. So you have public transport systems with increasing financial problems. It increases congestion, as I've mentioned. And you even have cases where local authorities are subsidizing Uber and Lyft to provide mobility rather than maintain low ridership public transport rides. So you've got, again, public money going into private companies to solve a mobility problem, a public mobility problem. Mainstream climate policy is failing. The Paris Agreement framework has proven to be completely inadequate. Most countries are, the NDCs, the nationally determined contributions, which are the pledges that countries were obligated to make under the Paris Agreement. The initial round were widely recognized as being completely inadequate, and nearly all countries are off track to meet even those. We are, as an aside, we're in conversation with some unions in the US about taking up a conversation with the Biden administration, the State Department, about strengthening the US NDC, which they're going to be submitting on April 22nd, the updated, hopefully strengthened NDC. Most of the NDCs do include some kind of commitment to sustainable mobility. The details are very thin, and just a third, not even a third, make a specific reference to emissions. And only 15 give any indication of a sort of concrete plan to deal with emissions in their upward course. And you had the Paris Process on Mobility essentially coming out and admitting that the NDCs do not yet provide a credible pathway for the transformation of transport, consistent with the Paris Agreement. Broadly, climate policy, aside from the NDCs, has relied on a couple of different mechanisms within the framework of green growth. So the idea that we're going to grow our way to sustainability, and the idea, the mechanisms, we talk about them in terms of sticks and carrots. So in terms of sticks, disincentives for pollution, carbon taxes, cap and trade, renewable portfolio standards, you could count in that, and so forth. Carrots are things like subsidies, feed-in tariffs for solar panels on your roof, incentives and guarantees to developers to build utility scale, 20-year contracts with guaranteed revenues, and so forth. But then we deal with those issues in detail in some of the other working papers. If people are interested in reading a more detailed account of the broader framework of climate policy that's failing, I'm happy to provide references. I think Fred or Michael probably can as well. But I want to focus in on transport in particular. There are two pieces of this that are especially important for us to have in mind, which is the reliance on electric vehicles, electric cars, essentially for personal mobility, and then a heavy reliance on public-private partnerships for the large-scale mass transit public transport projects that are pursued. And I'll talk about the problems with both of these. With EVs, these have been kind of the preferred option for a lot of policymakers. And the reason is simple. It's that it doesn't require you to do much change to your city's infrastructure, to how people live and work, to how they think of themselves getting around, and so forth. Yeah, the idea is, an EV in every garage, and that will somehow take us to the promised land. And people who advocate this, they point out that EV prices are falling and they're improving. So why not just pursue a replacement strategy? Recently, the growth rates have been pretty impressive. This year, global sales reached a little over 3 million. That was nearly 5% of total vehicle sales in 2020. That sounds impressive until you do the math and realize that it's still just that EVs in total, 7.2 million on the roads, still just account for 0.5% of total vehicles on the world's roads. There's little point even developing a graph because you just can't see it on the bottom, this tiny little wedge. And there's some other limitations with where there's some reasons why that doesn't work, but there are some reasons that that it would be a bad idea even if you could get it to work. One would be that the mass deployment of EVs would have an enormous impact on demand for electricity. So at the same time you're trying to decarbonize electricity generation, you're ramping up demand for that electricity massively. Essentially, one EV effectively roughly doubles household demand for electricity. So you just buy an electric car and your electric demand has essentially doubled in many cases. When that electricity is used when the electricity that's used to charge the EV is not from low carbon sources, renewables or nuclear or something like that, the actual reductions in emissions are really not that significant. The IEA's executive director, Fatih Birol, pointed out that even if you could increase the number of EVs on the road by 60 times, the impact on emissions would be minimal given the current generation mix, the way that electricity is generated currently from coal and gas heavily. But it would also, this sort of deployment strategy, replacing petrol cars with electric cars, would also do nothing to deal with problems of congestion and accidents, interference with public transport, as I mentioned before. It's also only possible if the charging infrastructure is growing simultaneously. And that's a major problem because as long as you're relying on private investors to build out the charging infrastructure, they're not going to do that until the cars are there, until the demand for the electricity is there, because there's no guarantee that they'll have a market. So it's a kind of chicken and egg thing. It's what they call a infant infrastructure problem. You can't get people, private investors who are dependent on profits, to build the infrastructure until there's a guaranteed market, and you can't create the market until the infrastructure is there to support it. Just as a little aside, there's also this whole problem of sort of excavating Bolivia and turning it into batteries for people's electric vehicles, to say nothing of all of the other minerals around the world. So that's EVs. Then I want to turn to this idea of relying on public-private partnerships to drive the big mass transit projects. Again, public-private partnerships introduce the requirement for profit. That means higher borrowing costs, transaction costs, and so forth. Drives up prices for the people who end up using the service that's built through these contract mechanisms. But P3s also favor big mega projects, sort of big flashy trains that go to the airport in 7 minutes or something like that, because those are more likely to cater to sort of a business class audience. They're going to have better returns for developers. But they don't really serve the needs of working class communities. The kinds of projects that get built through these mechanisms just don't end up in the Bronx. But there's a sort of another reason for that, which is that in order to do the accounting, to sort of make sure that you're accounting for your revenues properly, which you would have to do if this is a private standalone contracted piece of the infrastructure system, what that means that it's very difficult to integrate into the overall system. You've got to have another ticketing gate between the public system and the private system so that the accounting can be done, so that you know where people get on and off and so forth. So it's very difficult to integrate these physically into wider systems. In general, public transport systems struggle to cover their operating costs. There simply isn't a market for that sort of mobility at the level of ticket price and at a scale of ridership that is going to tend to cover all of the costs associated with these massive infrastructure projects. An additional reason that they really should be seen as public services rather than as a commodified profiteering opportunity. But what that does is that if you're doing these through public-private partnerships, the developers, the people developing the projects will essentially insist on some kind of guaranteed subsidy or underwriting to ensure that the project is profitable, that if they're not going to be able to recover it from fare box revenue. But then that creates political risk, because if I'm an elected official, why would I go to bat for a project that has suddenly made headlines because people have found out that the developers are getting, a few $1 million a month underwriting their project? I'm getting some background noise. Is somebody not muted? Maybe I'll skip ahead here. No, I want to make this point actually. So the middle bullet here, neoliberalism has propagated the idea, the whole premise of neoliberal climate policy, including in transport, it has been that governments don't have the money, so we've got to go to the private sector. That's where the money is. And so we're going to have to find a way to incentivize them to put their money in to build out this transition infrastructure that we need, whether it's in electricity generation, trains, buses, public transport, whatever it is. But the World Bank did a report showing that actually most of the funding for public transport is actually coming from public funds. So there's no empirical basis for thinking that this premise that the private sector was going to provide the funding for these projects is true. It's just not true. And that's true in the global north and the south. According to this study, there's not a single public transport system that operates anywhere without subsidies for passengers or some kind of preferential financing arrangement. So we are already paying for this stuff through public budgets. So the challenge ahead, I want to spend a couple minutes here. One of the things that I think we're consistently at pains to try to draw attention to is the structural characteristics of the impediments to the energy transition. There's a lot of, in general, we do a lot of stuff on sort of the power sector, electricity generation, and you'll hear a lot of references or in relation to transport as well, road transport. You'll hear about our addiction to fossil fuels, our addiction to oil and so forth. And in fact, we think that's not a helpful framing, because it isn't that we're addicted to oil, it's that the infrastructure around which our cities are built depends on those fuels in order to provide power, mobility, all of the kinds of services that daily life depends on. So we've got to find a way to reframe it and recognize that we're talking about a decades-long process of rebuilding our cities to pursue the kinds of goals that we need to pursue. And that covers, I think, the first couple of points here. Reducing transport emissions requires much more than sort of divesting from these companies or something like that. That's not going to change anything. It means actually finding different ways of powering mobility, changing the transport infrastructure, and altering patterns of life and how we work. Even COVID did nothing to change the infrastructure of our cities. So it didn't really address any sort of structural change or enable any kind of structural change. Even the World Bank, hardly a bastion of left radical thinking, has acknowledged that we're just completely off track to achieving the kind of sustainable mobility that we need. Not just the challenge ahead, but also the opportunity. Public transport, for all of its problems, it is actually thriving in many parts of the world. The availability of mass public transport has nearly doubled over the last 25 years. It's largely in the global south, but there's a significant track record of achievement and accomplishment. In the EU, public transport has risen quite significantly over the recent years. Just want to skip ahead a little bit for the sake of time. The main problem, despite all of this expansion of public transport, is that it has been unable to keep up with the huge change in urban populations and the rising needs for mobility that people have. So what's an alternative? Where do we go from here? And talk in the paper about a transitional program for mobility as possibly a way to think about this. Several points here, and I'll only talk about a couple of these in any detail, but it's worth noting that these all would need to be part of a strategy, a transitional program strategy. Fight to limit private vehicle ownership and use. That would include things like congestion charges, for example. People in New York are familiar with those. Modernize and electrify existing public transport systems. Get rid of P3s. Occupy the platform. I'll spend a little time on that in a moment. Electrify all remaining transport. And then, of course, we need to decarbonize all electricity. These are, roughly speaking, elements of the kind of program that would get us, that could get us where we need to be. Modernize and electrify public transport, the first of those. In order to really maximize public transport's contribution, it needs to be upgraded and electrified, upgraded meaning modernized. A lot of urban passenger rail runs on electricity. This has driven down energy consumption. Public bus fleets are way behind. Nearly all electric buses are in China. 99% of the electric buses in the world are in China, the last time I checked, which was, I think, about a year ago. But it's worth keeping in mind that even a partially filled diesel bus is much more energy efficient than people driving their cars. So we should be supporting getting people into buses even before those buses are electrified. And electric buses are more efficient even when the electricity used for them is generated from coal and gas, but even more so when they're generated from low carbon sources. Getting rid of public-private partnerships. We've got to get rid of the idea that public transport needs to operate on a full cost recovery basis. It's got to be provided as a subsidized public service. It's got to be seen as a fundamental enabling condition of the economy rather than a part of the economy that's expected to generate money for somebody, generate profits for somebody. And instead of P3s, we need to massively upgrade and expand existing public transport systems with public funding, financing as functioning as public services. Occupy the platform. I think this is maybe where some more provocative thinking comes in. The kinds of public transport that we're used to are going to be important, but they're not sufficient on their own, given the way cities have changed and people's expectations for mobility have changed, and the way technology's changed and the kinds of things that are possible now. But what we need to be thinking about, the second bullet, is integrating public car sharing. Since we're not going to succeed in taking over Uber and Lyft right away, but what we could be fighting for is public competitors to them. Car sharing, ride hailing services that can be integrated into public transport systems. You can then coordinate comprehensively mobility as a service. It also would allow having public fleets of those vehicles could be standardized, fully electrified. You get economies of scale that way in the manufacture. And they could all be charged using public infrastructure at a central depot, so forth. But we also need to think about how this promotion of integrated public mobility across all of these modalities could also begin to inform how we reimagine patterns of work, production of food, production of energy, and so forth. It also needs to keep an eye on limiting the kinds of mobility that are unnecessary and damaging and ecologically destructive, luxury travel, business class travel, things like that. Another part of this is the data that these companies actually rely on to do what they do and to improve their ability to undermine public transport. So we think that cities have a right and should try to get control over the data that these companies use. We should, first of all, regulate the companies, limit numbers of vehicles, limit where they can serve, hours that they can serve as appropriate. But the roads that they use were all funded with public funding. The satellites that they rely on for getting around were funded, that's a publicly funded communications network. And we need to keep all of these things in mind in shaping how we fight for, public ownership and control over these technologies and over these services. And again, so that they can support rather than undermine the broader public transport systems that we're trying to build up and strengthen and modernize and electrify. And we think that these private companies like Uber and Lyft should be required to, provide the data that they do have so that we can use those to improve the systems that we want. just a final kind of thought-provoking quote. The future of urban mobility stands at a crossroads. You know, essentially, if we go back to pre-COVID patterns of life and mobility, it's going to be very, very challenging to see the kinds of shifts that we need to make. And quickly, I'll just draw attention to the fact that the ITF, the International Transport Workers Federation, has been working around these issues since 2010, I think even earlier, but 2010 was a sort of important moment when they issued this first report, beginning to try to conceptualize a transport sector workers' labor approach to the climate challenge and transport's role in that. More recently, they've developed a series of policy documents which we helped on. There was one of, I think, 6 papers, is this one on public ownership. And then there was another one on climate change that we wrote for and with them. And I think that's it. So I'll stop there. Sorry if I went on too long.
Thank you, John. That was very good and good PowerPoint. Thank you very much. So we'll open the floor up to comments, questions, and Carol, you are already ahead of me. You're up first on stack, so go ahead, Carol.
Okay. Wow. This is really a great chapter, and I did not know about this, the ITF, and I also didn't know about your organization at CUNY. I lived in New York and was involved in the bicycling movement there, left a few years ago, but I'm just wondering what are the options? So there is a big movement across the country to increase biking and walking in cities. Is there, what's the connection between the labor movement and this more millennial driven mobility movement? Is your group involved with any of the mass transit cycling groups in New York?
Short answer is no. Again, it's a global network of unions. We're based in New York, but we're not particularly active in New York as opposed to other places. In fact, there are more active and important conversations happening in Mexico and in France right now than in the US. But I mean, certainly those kinds of human-powered forms of mobility would need to be part of this wider picture. But I think it's essential to realize that for the vast majority of working people, that's not an option for day-to-day life. We've got to find solutions that are going to allow people to get several miles away to a cleaning job or a restaurant job, and that is going to have to be public transport, and public transport's going to have to be motorized and electrified. There's no substitute for moving people at scale like that. So I don't know, that doesn't feel like an adequate answer. I'm not trying to be discouraging at all.
I'm wondering if you've had any conversations with these groups. I mean, in New York City anyways, a lot of people do get around to those kinds of jobs with bikes, but it's very dense. I mean, where I live in San Diego, there's no way, because it's hilly and there are 4 gazillion SUVs going 60 miles an hour on local roads. Right. So, but is there not a option? I mean, my understanding of some of these mobility groups is that they do favor public-private partnerships, which I've never been really a big fan of for the exact reasons that you're saying. But isn't there an opening if you have a lot of people? I mean, seems to be one area in the U.S. where people, at least in cities, have some agreement that there needs to be a carbon-free or carbon-reduced option for mobility. It just seems like there would be some options of connecting there. Not that I have it.
Yeah, I mean, I'd be interested to hear from other people on the call. We've not had contact with them. My own sense is that that's simply not a significant part of the solution that we need. I think it's a bit of a fetish. I mean, I'm an active bicycler, but I don't think it solves the problem remotely. It's a drop in the ocean. So, but I'd be very happy to be proven wrong. So that would give me hope. I would sleep better at night. So an open appeal to everyone on the call. Please prove me wrong about bicycles in cities for mass mobility.
Kashmira, you're on stack and you're up, Kashmira.
First of all, thank you, John, for this nice presentation. I wanted to know about the just transition movement. How is it progressing in terms of organizing people for building resistance against the neoliberal policies in place and advocating for a climate system change? Because we see around the world people are organizing against their government. How is progress being made in US, and is there any kind of building alliances around the world? I am from Mauritius, for instance, and I can tell you that many workers are losing their job in the transport industry. So how do we build together? Thank you.
Thank you.
So Greg, go ahead.
So apologizes for being late, John, that you overlapped with my office hours on Zoom as it goes, where I kind of leave it open for my graduate students to come by. So my apologies. But I just wanted to begin by saying what you and Sean have been doing around this work, I think is the trade unions for energy democracy as a whole, but particularly what you've been doing about transit is, I think, by far and away some of the best work being done by socialists on a socialist intervention into current public policy debates, kind of in the best sense of using the notion of transition, where we can get a grip and a bite, even where we're weak, into current debates and kind of put forward anti-capitalist and decommodifying proposals. So I just want to kind of congratulate you and Sean for the amazing work you do, and anybody who hasn't should follow your work closely. And I would love to get the URLs to the last couple of documents you mentioned in your slideshow, which I hadn't quite seen yet, and I'm absolutely looking forward to. One of the things I in the own work doing on public transit struggles in Toronto, in Ontario, has been a slight bit different way that we've edged into some of these issues, and which you don't touch upon. But I was curious, some of the presentation I've done on this and just speaking with others has been a kind of a triangle around the issue related to infrastructure, just transition, and conversion of the plants for both kind of for the infrastructure and for the types of public transit vehicles that are needed. And I'm wondering what you've kind of come across in your research about examples of conversion. The example that you would have seen us writing about and speaking about was the GM plant in Oshawa up here, which was one of GM's foremost automobile assembly plants in North America. And we had a long struggle through Green Jobs Oshawa to convert it. And one of the strategies we put forward initially was particularly around EVs, but particularly EVs for the government to purchase the smaller truck vehicles for the post office, whether through that kind of thing. I was wondering if you have other examples in the sector that relate to conversion of the plant. So, it partly connects to that triangle I've kind of been thinking about, and then with the infrastructure, doing the infrastructure point, raising a lot of the kind of program that you were speaking about. So I just on that point, maybe on the link to the others, I think it's been hard to kind of make linkages with walkers and cyclist rights kinds of organization and connect them to public transit. I just, without a kind of political party or political organization that's big enough to kind of bring them together, they kind of go on their own. But I do think there's one really negative way that they come together, and that is a certain anti-car thesis. And that kind of has a certain unity in it, and it is part of the climate change struggle. So there's kind of like an innate, but I think it's part of the logic at a positive level is thinking about what you anchor much of your work in, and the rights to mobility, the rights to the city, as kind of a key kind of socialist demand that is, a generic demand that kind of is anti-capitalist, but also just for something we struggle for right now. And I think they all fit within that rubric. But I think also in terms of the practicality, I think some of the ways to think about this is also the last mile, so-called last mile problem in public transit, and the ways that we could think and link with cycling of a different kind of public way than Uber and Lyft for that last mile, and so on, and also kind of a very nice walking routes, etc. from a public transit thought, and so on. Kind of thinking about that, it seems to me there's kind of practical ways we have to also connect it to the last mile problem of public transit. I have a third question, if you don't mind, and it's kind of totally veers off in a different way, but it's a common problem in North American public transit system, and the reliance on the fare boxes, which Toronto, for the one of the biggest public transit users services in North America, has had an incredible drop off of ridership. We're down to only about 30% of normal loads, and that's really difficult when 70% of the revenues that fund the public transit are coming from the fare box. And I'm just wondering about how you have been thinking and and linking it into the general transitional strategy you're putting forward, kind of that real crisis in revenue sources right now for public transit, and at a point in time where we're needing to sustain public transit as an alternative to the fossil fuel reliance on the private automobiles.
So John, you have quite a bit between Kashmira and Greg.
Sorry.
No, that's fine. I can respond to those, and then we can go back to the stack. Is that okay with everyone?
Yeah, that's good.
Yeah, okay, all right. Let me see. So Kashmira, on just transition, yeah, I will first, let me put in the chat a link to the paper that we did on just transition. But I think the key point here, I don't know if people have heard of the Just Transition Center, which is the ITUC, the International Trade Union Congress, has set up this Just Transition Center, which is, I suppose, the main target of our criticism, at least implicitly in this paper. It is very much, there's the link to the working paper. The just transitions. So we get calls all the time, or emails saying, do you guys know about some good examples of just transition? My boss asked me to pull together some examples of just transition. And we always have to say, no, we don't, because there aren't really very many, if any. The key framing of the argument in the paper is to say that there are essentially, we want to say there are and there need to be two competing visions of just transition. Well, there don't need to be two, but there needs to be a second that we're advancing. So the bulk of a major part of the paper deals with this idea of social dialogue, right? Just transition as social dialogue. You get these tripartite commissions, government, employer, union, to sit around the table and talk about how to defend or protect the interests of workers as this transition happens. But our argument is the transition isn't happening, right? We're still headed off the cliff. So there are no worker interests to defend if you're headed off the cliff. You've got to actually pull things back from the cliff in order to have any chance of defending workers' interests. And we actually propose an alternative way of thinking about just transition, which is not social dialogue, but social power. And so it's not asking for a seat at the table to negotiate how workers can get slightly less screwed as we transition out of polluting industries, but rather how can we build a social force capable of altering the trajectory of the economy or major elements of the economy, particularly energy use, which is crucial, energy and finance. So maybe I'll leave it there for now, but I think if there's a nice introduction to the paper on that landing page. It'll give you a sense of whether you want to dive into the whole, I don't remember, 70 pages or so. But I think it's a very good paper. Sean deserves the lion's share of credit for that. He's the main voice of TUED. I came to this work fairly late, got radicalized while living in South Africa around climate change, and came to the left then, but have done what I could to catch up. So Maybe I'll just leave it there on just transition. Greg, several questions. On the conversion question, it's not something that I've tried to pay attention to in any detail. So again, I would defer that to other people who might be on the call. Really important part of the conversation. I think, our focus is trying to get enough people oriented correctly to the questions that we need to be asking, so that it begins to make sense to do that sort of detailed programmatic work. I feel like I'm speaking for Sean as well. We're not even at the point where those conversations are the right ones to have. We're still headed over the cliff, and we've got to stop that first. So I'll stop there. On bikes as anti-car allies, I mean, I'm an avid biker, but I've got a lot of sympathy for people who are anti-bike. I don't think cities full of bikes are nice places to be at all, of rabid bike riders. I mean, I think bicycles have a place in urban mobility. I don't think you should ask a 50-year-old builder or cleaner to get on a bike to get to a job in the rain or the snow. I think we've got to see that as a piece of the puzzle, but absolutely peripheral. We've got to deal with moving large numbers of people conveniently out of the weather, or we're screwed. It's not going to work. That is if I'm just being completely candid. And I think we've then got first mile, last mile, I think runs into some similar problems. Maybe it's great when the weather's okay, but when it's raining, if it's really raining, you can't ask people to do that on a bike. But if you haven't provided for another alternative for them to get home otherwise, then they're stuck walking in the rain or something like that. Now, I don't have a problem with people walking, some distance with an umbrella, but I think, let me leave it there. As I say, an avid biker, but I don't think bikes are a big part of the solution to the mobility issue that we face. On the fare box revenue, I wanted to include in the piece that we wrote for Socialist Register something on what I would call the radical horizon, which is fare-free public transport for all. There are all kinds of studies showing that if you just eliminate payment for public transport, it operates substantially more efficiently, because you don't have to have the driver worrying about giving change. You don't have to stand in line looking for their transit card or for some coins. Jump on, jump off. Immediately, you have a significant improvement in the performance, which is going to draw more people onto public transport, get them out of their cars, which further improves it. So I think that I think we should be fighting for, mobility as a free public service, like libraries or something like that. It's a fundamental enabling condition of the economy. We should reimagine it completely and get away from the idea that it needs to cover its costs. Sidewalks don't cover their costs. We don't charge people to ride elevators most of the time. So I think we should. I think we should see buses and trams as horizontal elevators, and let people get on as they want. And then you eliminate the issue of revenues, of the fall in fare box revenues. I don't know if I think I covered what I had there. I will also. I'm going to put the link to the ITF. A couple people have asked for that. The ITF's public transport policy is there.
Hey, we now have David and Nicole, who are both in stack. So David, and then after you, David, will be Nicole.
Two quick questions. You mentioned that China has a huge fleet of electric buses, and that made me think, I don't know, maybe I don't know how much you actually have studied about China, but I'm wondering because China's created in the last 30 years these huge new urban areas, and I wonder if you know how they very much about the public transportation there, and whether it conforms to any of these kind of futuristic things that we need to think about in terms of carbon neutrality and so forth. Because I see that, I know China has built this great public transportation system, but on the other hand, it's also seen by car manufacturers as this huge new market for private automobiles. So there's that. And then if you don't mind, I just wanted to chime in briefly on what you think about the Biden infrastructure proposal. I don't know what it will look like after it goes through Congress, and to what extent you think, obviously there's some good stuff there, but whether you think it's anything worth thinking about too much. That's it.
Yes, thank you so much for this. It's like everything you're saying is like, oh my God, except the bike thing. I disagree on that. But well, if we could get a link to the slideshow, that would be great. So I'm especially interested in what you said about the reducing transport requires more than challenging oil companies. It means finding alternate ways of, altering patterns of living and working, which I think is sort of like the hard part. It's one thing to remove minimum parking requirements. It's another to, change how people work and like the economics. So do you have any sense of what the people in the unions are doing to challenge that, how that can be supported, or is that still sort of like sort of theory and not practice?
John, there are no other people on stack at the moment. So David and Nicole's questions and comments.
Yeah, China, I do not know a great deal about how overall they're dealing with sort of urban mobility questions. I mean, one thing to keep in mind, and this has major implications not only for transport, but for the whole electrification of the power system that we're talking about, which I kind of alluded to earlier, and the idea of getting to 100% renewables. I think, the more I've come to understand about the challenges of providing reliable electricity at the scale necessary to power a modern city, and that means hospitals, public transport, shopping centers, art centers. Exactly. Yeah. Lights to do your homework with. One of the challenges is because, there are many, but because the wind doesn't always blow and the sun doesn't always shine, you've got to massively overbuild the generating capacity of wind and solar if you're going to rely solely on them. You've also got to then massively account for storage, not only at night, but also in the winter, which is an order of magnitude more difficult problem. And with all of that, what you're then talking about is almost unimaginable quantities of raw materials that would need to be mined, processed, moved around the world, turned into stuff, installed. It's truly a staggering, these are staggering quantities of material and energy that you're talking about. And most of that energy is going to be fossil fuels to process things, to build renewable power infrastructure. That's the bottom line. And that's in fact the only thing that we should be using fossil fuel, or one of the only things we should be using fossil fuels for as soon as absolutely possible. And I know that there's a region in Mongolia, I think it's called Bautu or something like this, which has essentially been turned into a toxic moonscape. It's uninhabitable, miles and miles and miles of this, simply because of the processing of rare earth metals and so forth. So there's a huge set of issues that have to be kept in mind there. It's part of the reason that I think we're trying to get a substantial part of the global labor movement focused on having not conceptual level discussions about how we want to live, how we imagine providing energy, but detailed programmatic work with engineers and spreadsheets and numbers to begin to work out concretely, how do we get from where we are now to where we want to be, to where we need to be. So I'm not trying to be evasive with the question, but I'm just trying to say that I think the kinds of questions about the detailed level questions about, what China's doing with specific solutions to urban mobility, I don't think we're trying to answer those necessarily. We're trying to convene a group of people to bring more capacity into this discussion so that we can collectively begin to answer those sorts of questions, as well as these questions about materials and so forth. That doesn't, again, feel like an adequate answer to your question, and I'm sorry, I failed to make a note of your second question. I know you asked a second question, but I didn't write it down.
I just asked what your thoughts were about the Biden
Biden, that's right. Yeah,
right?
Sorry. Yeah, we're actually studying that at the moment, right? We're convening a group of unions next week to talk about a few different things, including the Biden infrastructure plan, as well as the new NDC. And I don't know if people know that Cory Bush's office, in the context of the recent Texas disaster, Cory Bush came out with a statement saying that the utilities should be taken back under public control. So we're actually working with her office now on sort of some specific language around a possible resolution. So we are, I mean, I think, the infrastructure plan, well, it's an omnibus bill, which raises its own issues. And I think they're now talking about doing doing some of this through budget reconciliation and so forth. The charging station build out that they're talking about will presumably be done as a public-private partnership, so we would have issues with that. But it's too soon to know kind of how the conversation would play out. Our focus again is on bringing together unions that can bring enough attention and sort of detailed capacity to bear on that, so that we can collectively take a harder look at it. And then Nicole, you had asked about unions that are kind of involved in these fights. I mean, this is the network that we're trying to build right now. As I say, we've got 85 unions from 25 countries currently. Maybe I should say a bit about kind of the active fights that are ongoing at the moment. It's not so much in the US, although we do have some good allies in the US, but there's in Mexico, the Mexican government, AMLO's government, has been making moves to try to reverse some of the privatization steps that the previous administration took to essentially reestablish public ownership of the petroleum, the oil industry, oil and gas industry in Mexico significantly, and has been under attack. There was a letter written by Ted Cruz, and there's some other people in Congress that have been sort of pushing back through the kind of, the international investor protection mechanisms that are available, the treaties and so forth, to try to say, we're going to sue you because you're taking away our profits. The unions are supporting this move by AMLO. ESME, which is the famous radical electrical workers union, we're in an active conversation with them, as well as the petroleum workers union. We had a call a couple of weeks ago with the Undersecretary of Energy, who is also kind of leading this fight. And in the context of that, what you've had is, because AMLO is saying we are going to take back control of the fossil fuel industries and reestablish national sovereignty, and then we are going to use those to help our people. You have groups like Greenpeace that have actually come out on the side of Ted Cruz, right, against AMLO's moves. We had a meeting with their Mexico office. They had a lawyer on and everything. It was amicable enough, but they're just dead wrong. If I have a chance, I'll try to dig up. Oh no, it hasn't been published yet, but Sean's written a paper on this, a background paper that details kind of the whole conversation, where it's come from. But that's an example. So we're now actively working with the unions in Mexico on this fight, trying to bring attention to it, and trying to support their efforts to support the government in essentially fending off these attacks from Wall Street and Washington against Mexicans taking back control of their own energy, so that they can do a planned transition to a low carbon future system, as opposed to just doing what investors want them to do. In France, people may have seen this, it made headlines, and we did a couple of bulletins on it. There's an ongoing fight to defend the public energy company there, EDF, which is under attack by the government. They're trying to, what they call, unbundle. If you ever hear the term unbundling in the context of an energy company, it's part of the World Bank's playbook to essentially dismantle and then privatize parts of national energy companies, utilities, and so forth. We're in a very productive conversation with the mining and energy division of the National Federation in France around defending EDF as public. That has led to plans for a meeting in June, a major sort of strategic meeting to develop a global charter for public energy, for a public energy future, with them and some of the other unions that we work with around the world, that we hope could become a kind of flag in the sand that unions could rally around and to kind of organize and coalesce a lot of these fights. So those are the kinds of things that we're engaged in. Again, there's not a lot happening in the US at the moment that's comparable to those. We'll see what happens if this Cori Bush resolution gets some traction. We're having what feels like a very productive conversation with her office right now, her legislative director, that we hope can lead to some, begin to bring visibility to the need to fight for public control of energy in the US as well.
Thanks, John. Carol is on stack again. Carol?
Well, so I guess my question again is about the infrastructure plan. It seems like our infrastructure is falling apart in so many ways, and now Biden wants to devote $2 trillion to however much it is, $2 trillion. So a lot of the projects are going to be car related. They're going to be bridges that are falling down. And granted, I drove across country a couple years ago, and I saw a dozen bikes on my trip and 5 gazillion cars. So it's true that the United States really depends on the automobile. But the further we go of building the infrastructure without accommodating, what about putting, train tracks on some of the bridges that are car only, right? I'm got to get this to a question. What's the possibility that this infrastructure plan could be moved to leave an opening for the future in terms of train, trolley track, bike and pedestrian access? A lot of the bridges aren't open to anything but a private automobile. So how do we move in that direction if we're going to be making this big investment in infrastructure?
I mean, my short, cheeky answer would be, yeah, you and whose army, right? I mean, it's a political question. Where's the social force, right? Where are the unions or other comparable social force to get a significant shift in a plan like that that's floating through the halls of power in Washington? I suspect you and I would have broadly very similar visions of what we would like that plan to be. We're doing what we can to organize the forces that might be able to intervene at some future point. It's not going to happen this year, I don't think. I mean, you never know what's going to happen. Maybe there's some massive industrial accident and suddenly everything shifts and you get the new Occupy Wall Street, but it's Occupy infrastructure, or a lot of it's unpredictable. But Joe Biden doesn't take my calls. Let me just.
Like Transportation for America, aren't they involved in promoting mass transit issues? There are some national groups. We're marginalized, definitely, but we can write our congressmen. We can do, there's stuff we can do.
Gene, you're on stack. Go ahead, Gene.
I figure I better venture in here. This is a very interesting conversation. Just to situate myself, I have been a socialist, active, intervening socialist for about 50 years. During 30 of those years, I was working in a paper mill here in the lower mainland of British Columbia. And for 10 of those years, I was president of the local. For 22 of those years, I published a monthly newsletter for the local. So I was involved up to my elbows in everything that happened in the plant, but also in my union, which has gone through a number of transitions from being a paper workers union to being a merger to being an even larger merger. And a good deal of my fighting that happened outside the mill was against the leadership of the trade union movement rather than the politicians. So the question that keeps on coming back to here and that John keeps on referring to is how do we get things done? Where do we get the social power? Where do we get the social force? And I'm wondering, because I agree with you that unions are a major part of it, although right now in British Columbia, which historically has been a very radical union place and had been on the verge of a general strike twice in the last 20 years, is now pretty much moribund in terms of the union movement doing anything even to defend its own members, let alone moving into larger spheres. But one thing that did happen on both sides of the border in the last short while that was a mobilization of a social force was the Green New Deal idea. And I'm wondering if any consideration is being given to the possibilities of remobilizing the literally tens of thousands of people who went to meetings and thrashed out problems at the community levels. Because I think that, you know, when we talk about transportation, we're talking about one part of a system, a highly integrated system. So we're not going to be able to fix transportation without fixing or integrating those fixes into a number of other changes in the system. My experience, again, from working in the mill is we went through and other places, but this is where I got it. The idea the first time was we went through a financial crisis in our mill about 20 years ago. And we were challenged by the company to be part of a, you know, bilateral problem-solving operation, which we were not going to get into in the way that they wanted us to. But we got into it in the way of saying, we'll sit down with you, with our members, to talk about problems. Because you guys don't know the solutions and we don't know the solutions because we don't work in all of the areas in the mill. But when we sat down with the members and started talking about stuff, a lot of it was wasted time. A lot of it was like people being ticked off and stuff like that. But sometimes there were like amazing proposals for, you know, solutions that could go together with other things that actually worked and saved the mill. I went to a number of Green New Deal meetings, and in Canada, it was slightly different than it was in the States. There was no legislation in Canada. There was no sort of legislator-led movement as there was in the United States. But it still did involve lots and lots of people thrashing out ideas. So I'm thinking both because that kind of a setup produces more resources to start finding solutions, but also because that sort of setup starts to train the people that are going to be necessary to run the operation. I mean, when we're talking about just transition, or we're talking about like unions hiring the right people to get the programmatic solutions of nuts and bolts and financing and stuff like that, we're not talking about the people who are going to oversee these things in the future, right? If we set up a transition, it's going to be a period where we have to fight against the people who are going to try and take it back, as we've seen in the last 30 years with, you know, the neoliberal offensive, taking back the gains of the welfare state. Anyway, I'm throwing a lot of stuff in here, but my main focus is, can we reactivate something like a citizens or a residents mobilization like the Green New Deal did? I think it might be an essential part of it.
I mean, no, I don't know. I posted in the chat that we actually did convene an international conference on the Green New Deal in November 2019. The report's available online. People might be interested in that. I don't know. I mean, I think that, yeah, it feels like a question that's not really for me. I mean, I think that's a question for all of us is, you know, how could we begin to organize on the basis of, well, on the basis of what would we organize to get a comparable kind of level of activation and interest and so forth, and who would lead that?
Can I just throw in another little piece of it? Like, I had a conversation with one of the leaders of our union, and our union has, through its last couple of transitions, represented most of the energy workers in Canada. And we were having big discussions about just transition, right? Making sure that when we, you know, shifted to green, that energy workers would be covered and stuff like that. And this guy, who is the regional vice president of the union, said, you know, I go to the members and I talk about just transition, and they say bullshit. You know, we're not gonna live in a society that that shuts down hospital workers and fires hundreds of hospital workers and workers that take care of old people and to take care of kids at risk and stuff like that, and then spend billions of dollars protecting the livelihoods of overpaid energy workers. Like, we just don't believe that's going to happen. So don't talk to us about just transition. So what I'm saying is, in order to get union members in a lot of cases believing that something's better, we have to start talking to them about their kids, their schools, their neighborhoods, their cities, their transportation systems.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, part of the reason that we wrote the paper on just transition that we did was because we think the concept of just transition, the way it's come to function, is completely toxic. Most workers that you try to talk to about just transition, they don't want to hear about it because you just put them on notice that they're about to be fired, or, you know, that you envision them having to either, you know, lose their job or go learn how to code or do something else that they're not particularly interested in doing at 55 or 50 or 40 or, you know, however old. I mean, the paper's written kind of as a provocation against the dominant narrative around just transition, which is precisely the narrative that feeds into this, it's time for you to be put out to pasture kind of messaging. And but the starting point of the paper is there's no transition. Like the transition isn't happening. There are disruptions. There's industrial disruption happening, but that's just chaos. Transition means you're going from A to B. There's no B yet. We're trying to get people to see that we're not on the way to B. We're on the way to X, which is off the cliff. And we've got to get enough people understanding that we have to challenge the direction in which things are going, rather than just better protections for people as they fall off the cliff into the sea. And I think that it connects with the conversation about people's children. We're doing everything we can to find the right language, the right vocabulary, the right arguments, the right data to make that case and to kind of wrench people's heads around and get them to see that the stuff they see in the newspapers, the stuff they hear from the Just Transition Center, that's all delusional. It's not happening. We are headed for catastrophe right now. We're not headed toward, you know, even an unjust transition. We're headed toward chaos. We're headed toward mass migration, people fighting over canned goods in the streets. I came to climate when I was living in South Africa. Before South Africa, I spent 7 years in Bosnia and Herzegovina after the war there, organizing farmers. And I think that gave me a unique perspective on when I started reading into climate change and reading about things like social breakdown. I had a very vivid picture of what that means. It made the little hair on the back of my head stand up. I actually walked away from a career to figure out what to do about climate change because I realized I didn't know what to do and that wasn't acceptable. So
we have,
and that doesn't mean that you should listen to me necessarily. I may not be right, but that's, you know, I was committed at least.
okay, Carol is on stack and Nicole as well. So Carol and Nicole.
Okay, thank you. Since nobody else was on the stack, I raised my hand again. And several of our chapters that we've discussed in this group have talked about the need to reduce the volumes of international trade goods, to satisfy our needs closer to home. Was it last week that was fashion? Or was it the week before? You know, the vast quantity of clothing that's being shipped overseas, not providing a living for the people who are doing it, and then 20%, he said in his chapter, was just being thrown away. So as you point out, I think you said that 30% is trade and 70% is transit.
Roughly.
So there's still a ton of, and talk about unnecessary trips. I live in San Diego County, and it is, I don't know where these people are going and why they're all in such a rush. It's this constant frenetic movement. And granted, I'm not commuting to a job anymore. So, but a lot of people aren't commuting. They just are out driving. You know, how do we change the culture so that there's other things to do with their lives than drive from one place to the other unnecessarily? So I don't know if you have any thoughts on changing, U.S. culture that we spend so much time in our cars.
It's more of a comment, but related to the labor thing. I just posted a link in the chat to a little like meme on it, which I thought was great actually. And it just basically, it's like, the sort of reactionary thing about just transition and green jobs is like, we're going to lose our jobs or blah, blah, blah. But it ends with like labor has the power to shape the future, and they're either going to be a part of it or they're going to fall prey to it at the hands of, oil companies basically. And so I liked what John, you had said earlier. Somebody said, maybe it wasn't John, about orientation and orienting people. And maybe this even flows into what Carol is saying, but like orienting people in labor and outside of labor towards this common goal of, green, clean technology doesn't have to be a luxury. It should be a public good owned by the public by public workers for our own benefit, for our own prosperity, that isn't tied to this vision of prosperity that we currently have, which is basically petroleum based, and we could have a new future.
Sheila, is that how I say your name? Okay, you can.
It is, and I missed your talk because I was in a meeting. So maybe you've already mentioned this, but I just, the conversation is making me think about the role of land speculation and developers and where public transit gets built. I'm part of a membership-based transit users group here in Toronto, and you know, privatization and public transit is not just about who operates the transit system and who builds it. That's a big part of it, but it's also about where projects get developed. And to Carol's point, you know, it's not just changing the culture, right? It's about how cities are designed and land use policy. But a lot of pension funds are profiting, you know, from P3s in Canada, transit development, but also own some of the development companies that have lobbied for things like the Scarborough subway extension. That's OMERS actually, who's part of Oxford, or part owner of Oxford Properties. So like around the programmatic elements, just thinking about the role of pension funds as well. And anyway, sounds like a great discussion. I'm going to read the paper.
Great. I can come back on that. I'm just because I'm worried that there might still be someone on the call who doesn't hate me. So I'm going to make sure everybody hates me now. So I don't know if people saw, there was a piece, it was just last week, a former senior executive at BlackRock writing about, who's now doing something else, but writing about why divestment is a fool's errand. Because as soon, and I know there's a lot of interest in divestment, but as soon as a pension fund pulls out of that, I mean, what they've achieved is their sort of moral purity. Some hedge fund just buys it up. It has absolutely zero impact on the company. It has no impact on energy consumption. It has no impact on anything except that pension fund is now no longer sort of complicit on that level. And I don't want to say that that's nothing, but it's not, it's no step at all towards structural change. What we've tried to I did kind of try to raise this issue in the talk. I don't know how successfully, but one of the points I was at pains to make is that getting away from public-private partnerships, you know, divesting and all of this doesn't do anything to change the infrastructure and the energy dependency on which our economies, you know, rely right now. And so what we need is a vision and a social force cohering around that vision that is prepared to challenge ownership of all forms of energy. The problem isn't the fossil fuel industry. I mean, a lot of green tech companies are just as bad or often worse in terms of labor practices. We need all of that under public control because there's no other way to have a planned, coordinated transition from the fuels on which our economies are currently dependent to alternative fuels that might be consistent with a sustainable future. And so a lot of the kind of dominant, I mean, the dominant climate policy narrative is green tech good, black tech bad. And so we're going to make the polluter pay. We're going to give incentives for people to build solar panels and wind turbines and so forth. And we've done a series of working papers and some shorter articles showing, I think, people who spend the time to read the materials, I think generally come away thinking that we've made a pretty comprehensive case that it has absolutely abjectly failed. There's no transition happening whatsoever. What you're having is an expansion of the consumption of all forms of energy. I just yesterday created a new graph for a separate paper that we're working based on the latest data on global energy from BP. They're a big nasty fossil fuel company, but they have an extremely competent data processing unit and they publish all of their data so you can use it. And there's a famous graph from a few years ago that shows sort of total world energy consumption over the period of about 30 years, and then the amount of wind and solar. And it's this tiny little sliver of each at the bottom and not remotely growing as fast as overall energy consumption. And I just redid it so that we would have a fresh version yesterday from the newest data. And it's even more striking now. It's you literally almost can't see the amount of power being generated and consumed from wind and solar, which are kind of the most important modern renewables. So there's no transition happening yet. And so what we're trying to say is we need to have a completely different conversation and recognize that until we get a sufficient social base organized around the fact that we are still headed off a cliff, we're going to go off the cliff. The future that we're headed toward right now is not people with really crappy jobs installing solar panels. There aren't going to be solar panels, 80 years from now. There's going to be serious chaos. And I don't know if you were on when I mentioned that I came to climate change after having lived in Bosnia and Herzegovina for a long time after the war. But it gave me a very different perspective on where we might be headed at scale. So, and I always have to temper how and when I talk about that, because you can't give people the really ugly vision all the time. But I think there are times when people need to be reminded of just how grave the situation is, and that we're not even headed in the right direction yet. We're still headed in the wrong direction. In fact, IRENA just issued a major report, and in the opening paragraphs of this, they say the world is headed in the wrong direction. And then they go on to say, but the energy transition is happening and it's unstoppable. Now, you can't square those. So we're actually calling them out in the opening section of this paper that we're writing for Transnational Institute. It should be out in a couple of months. Sorry, I'm rambling a little bit. I'm going on a bit now, but I'll stop.
Hey, John, I'm on Stack. I don't know how well I'll put my query, but since you are part of organized labor's dealing with the massive climate change problem based in fossil fuels, and not just the fuels, but the tremendous buildings and everything else that need to be cooled and heated, et cetera, that are mostly made with glass that is depleting the sand of the world. There are just so many factors that are tipping points that are in my mind, based on what you are saying your experience was with Bosnia-Herzegovina. So I look at the auto workers union for a good example, to stop the auto workers from continuing to make 95 million cars this year and 101 million cars in 2024, et cetera. We need somehow for them to have a life that's worth living after the car production stops. Will they, and this is the old, do you want clean air, clean water, and lungs until you're 86 or 7? Or do you want a job? And it does come down to this whole question of jobs or a livable environment, which is how capital always puts it to us. But then when you mention the need to have tremendous mass transit, and this is obvious, there is mention that we will need to take other type of rare earth minerals to for that total electrification that will have serious impacts as well. So I would imagine that another part that isn't even taken up yet is the major recycling of all these cars. We need to decommission all that metal in some way. And because it's so much injection molded plastic with all these other materials, it's tremendously difficult to deal with these contraptions, let alone all the others. I do feel that we need in this to be talking to those workers in unions who are understanding this, and we need to bring the understanding to those unions, or we're not starting in any of the right places. But I know there's been work done in the CAW and the UAW and in auto worker unions throughout the world. I don't know, if you could speak to those workers most impacted by the needed change and what work you're doing there would be great.
Sure. Let me try. I mean, I'll come back on a couple of things. Yeah, let me just back up a little bit. So part of the reason that we focus on energy rather than some other sort of some other industrial sector, right? And the word other already gives it away, because I would say energy is not just an industrial sector. It's that, I mean, energy, finance, labor are fundamental enabling conditions of an economy. You don't have an economy without those three things. It's not possible. You can have an economy without glass, you can have an economy without a lot of other things, but those are structural conditions of an economy. If you get public control, democratically accountable public control with a class-inflected vision of energy, you can control an awful lot. You can begin to decide what kinds of uses of energy are legitimate. Can you use energy to manufacture personal automobiles? I would vote no in that meeting. You know, it's a fundamental choke point on the economy, right? Now, not to overestimate our ability to kind of exercise that power, but it does give a different. It provides a different opportunity for intervening in the trajectory an economy is taking, in the same way that public control of finance would. If you have control over what kinds of things can be financed, you've got a significant amount of power. And what that does is it changes all of the conversations about about the use of raw materials, about manufacturing, about infrastructure, about public transport. Literally everything changes if you've got control of energy, or I mean, in principle, potentially. We are going to, it's inevitable that we are going to use fossil fuels in the United States for decades. In China, in India, they're going to use fossil fuels for decades. We need to be using less of it as rapidly as possible, but there's no way to build the alternative energy infrastructure that we need without using those fossil fuels. That's it. We can't stop using fossil fuels right now because everything just shuts down, and there's no electricity in the future without that. And now, just in case there might still be somebody who doesn't hate me, again, the further I've gotten into understanding electricity in particular, electricity is a very funny thing. It essentially has to be used as soon as it's generated. You can't pour electricity in the basement. You can develop, very high-tech storage solutions, but you can't just store it in space, in empty space, the way you can fossil fuels. That one annoying little fact actually has profound implications. And among those implications are this thing that I mentioned early on about the enormous quantities of raw materials that would be necessary to power anything remotely like a modern economy on 100% renewables. And there's increasing numbers of studies being done about this. The IPCC vision is essentially, I mean, the common wisdom, and the IPCC reflects this as well, is that you can, in principle, get to about 80% renewables, but you've got to have 20% from somewhere else to balance things out, provide stability of load, stability of voltage, and so forth. And so is that clean gas? Is it, some imaginary form of storage? Because the storage technologies that would be necessary to fill that amount of demand are not remotely in existence yet, nothing close. Is it nuclear? Is it something else? So I've actually come around. I was an avid anti-nuclear activist until just the past couple of years. And I decided to dig into the stuff that I'd read previously. And you start to discover that there's an awful lot of disinformation that's been floating around about nuclear energy. I've not fully made up my mind yet, but I have at least I have humbled myself as I've come to realize that I may have been misinformed and operating on a lot of misconceptions. I don't know if people know who George Monbiot is, long-time environmental activist in the UK, who wrote a couple pieces back in about a decade ago, 2011, basically about his own kind of coming around and saying, I dig into all of the scientific literature and I realize all the stuff I thought was wrong. So again, I haven't made up my mind, but I would encourage people to at least consider the possibility that we may not all know as much as we thought we did about that stuff, and there may be a need to reconsider some of those options, and especially some of the newer versions of much safer reactor designs that are coming online now. Yeah. So, and then there are voices who say, well, we should just, if renewables use all these raw materials and there are all these downsides, you've got to cover mountains or oceans in windmills and things like this, then why don't we just, and if you say nuclear is okay, why don't we just go 100% nuclear? I mean, I don't think politically that's ever going to fly. I also don't think that you should go fully into any one technology. I think we should probably try to have a whole suite of technologies that we're relying on to spur innovation, development of different options, flexibility. I don't know enough technically to know what the right balance is, but I feel like I'm learning enough to know the kinds of questions that we should at least be asking collectively. On the jobs and the just transition question, just to come back to that. I mean, I'm a big believer that the US government and most national governments, at least in the global north, not in Europe, it's a different challenge there, can fund unlimited public jobs programs, a job guarantee program. So I think if you've got to get somebody out of a car plant or a coal mine or something, and he wants to go teach kids to play soccer or play jazz in the park, I think that we can pay him what he's making now to go do that.
Well, it's less true now, but what would you do with a whole town like Detroit that is almost a monoculture around the auto industry? It's less so now than it was, but there are parts of by region and by the way capital developed that have left large sectors that would need something more than repositioning or GBI or something like this.
Absolutely not GBI. I'm talking about a jobs program. I would have to go to Detroit and ask the people of Detroit what they wanted Detroit to be. Do you want to be an artist colony? Do you want to be a gourmet food destination? What do you want to do? And as long as you work out that you've got a sufficient productive capacity producing the kinds of things that people need and want to buy with the income that's being made available, that you're paying them to do the things that they want to do, as long as you don't have a serious mismatch between that, you don't have to worry about inflation. So I think we should have a completely different conversation about this, but that's where I land.
Fred, you've been quiet tonight, Fred. Is there anything you have been leading up all the eco-socialist study groups at the MEP for so long? I thought you would be hard to control on stack over here. Do you have any comment you'd like to make, Fred?
Not particularly. I mean, I always enjoy listening to John, and I have really learned, more from him tonight than I would actually bring to the table myself. So, no, I think it's been a good discussion. So I'm not going to prolong it unnecessarily.
Great,
Greg, go ahead, Greg.
Just maybe on some of what John was just finishing off, and maybe a slight dissent on a little bit what he was saying about just transition, which I largely agree with his critique. But it seems to me that getting just transition into collective agreements, as much as it's kind of symbolic, it does put a way for unions to to debate about just general labor market transitions and put it as forward as a collective issue. And in some senses, in Canada, the rundown of the numbers of workers in the fossil fuel sector has been enormous. And so there is this general question from just the way that the capitalist markets have been partly kind of pushing outside of that, you have some vehicle to kind of target some sort of mobility. And why it becomes important is largely because of neoliberalism. It's gutted almost every kind of substantive state-led adjustment program. And so we have nothing in a systematic way for training to occur and the rest of it. I largely agree with you, but I think it's not such a bad thing to be there as a point of struggle. But, it is, it has all the limits you've just been raising. But I think it also is a way that some of the other things of having things like that in collective agreements deals with the kind of open-ended way you just left the question about Detroit. If there's conversion or if there's transitions out of certain sectors that you want to do and you have plants there, to the extent that you're coupling this with a union that's mobilizing around those things, a union that's unions that are kind of thinking about workers' plans for that sector, you kind of just are overlapping with the kind of general demands you've been making as a whole. And for some ways, we have to get workers thinking beyond just the maintenance of the jobs as they exist in the area they have. And I don't know how you can kind of do that without kind of having some notion of workers' plans over time in those kinds of sectors coming out as part of the discussion, and even anchoring wider community discussions. So for example, in the debates that we've tried to spark in Oshawa around the GM plant, it has kind of come from a certain set of workers not being limited just to a group of workers, not just being limited to what the union was saying in negotiating, but widening it. And to widen it, they not only had to meet the workers in their sector, they had to take it to the labor councils and widen out and begin kind of putting forward, a range of demands of what could be done with that plant that they then took out to the community. So the community, in a wider sense, started coming behind some kind of the things that you just said about what does the community want. And there's a way then that we inject some thinking ahead about that. And once you start those discussions, it's very hard not to have some sort of reference point to something like a just transition as the way that you're dealing with the workers moving from that sector. I grant everything you're saying about the ITUC's position and the way it's largely a symbolic dodge for the real issue that's most directly at hand. But I don't know. I have a hard time finding a route that doesn't take us through some of those things.
Yeah, I mean, if I can respond to that. I mean, I think obviously we don't, and I assume nobody on the call opposes in the least workers in a situation like that fighting for appropriate aggressive compensation for, being displaced and so forth. What I wish is that we could find another way to have that conversation that doesn't pull it back into the language of just transition, because as soon as it's framed in terms of just transition, the implication is that it's part of the ecological transition, that's the reason they're getting kicked out of these jobs, and it's not. That's the point. Yeah. This is an industrial disruption. It has nothing to do with an ecological transition. It might have to do with some half-assed attempts at sparking an ecological transition. But I think it's vitally important that people understand that the pretext that the employer is using, or that the regional government or whoever, like wherever the pressure is coming from to shut these jobs down, that pretext is a lie. They're not doing this because they're committed to solving climate change. They're doing this because this is how they convince the people who keep them in office or give them power that this is what they're doing, for the ecological transition. So my fear is that it depoliticizes it, and that we need, our fight should be to repoliticize at every point. That's what I would say, I guess.
Yeah, that's where I agree with you, because coming at it as a socialist, the thing is, you've got to reach people where they're at, and they're at that point. And then that's all. It's just that's the point. I kind of agree with your critique, but it's kind of, you come into those situations, and that's where people are. At the most, they are kind of mainstream social democratic approaches to it. And we've got to do exactly what you speak to in terms of both the urgency of the climate issue, but also to kind of make the general case of the obstacles that come forward from kind of capitalist ownership and those social relations in around these infrastructures that have to transition into something else.
Yeah. I mean, I would hope that we could collectively work toward another framing, another way to help people understand what's happening there, that does allow the kind of political space to remain open in a generative way, rather than thinking that, this was going to happen eventually anyway, and so, we should just plan for grandpa to do something, or, I think it's...
I think Sheila is kind of an organizer of a transit riders group. You begin where everybody just better transit, not so expensive, is the place that, the working class and middle class riders of the public transit system begin. And then you want to drag them into kind of this other kind of critical vision of why our systems in North America are so truncated and so on and so on. It is the politics we need, without kind of the surrounding ideological and political organizations that are kind of making that part of a daily discourse. But obviously, as radicals, that's what our personal responsibility is at.
I have to apologize. I know Fred just jumped off. I also have an 8 o'clock that I need to get to right now. So I'm going to need to.
Fantastic, fantastic.
John, thank you
Thank you,
very
everyone.
much. Thanks for coming, Greg. I know
Yep.
you had an overlap tonight as well, but your talk was excellent. And Carol asked if you could email the PowerPoint presentation. It's good to meet you, Sheila and Jean. I maybe you've been here before, but well, welcome to the MEP's presentation.
Thanks.
I have to go myself. It was good meeting you and nice seeing you, Carol. We'll be in touch soon, Greg.